بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين اللهم لا سهل إلا ما جعلته سهلا وأنت تجعل الحزن إذا شئت سهلا اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Inshallah, we'll go and start with today's hadith. It's a little bit of a longer one, so inshallah we'll try to get through all of it and keep this session as short as possible, inshallah. Hadith number 4. عن أبي عبد الرحمن عبد الله بن مسعود رضي الله عنه قال حدثنا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم وهو الصادق المصدوق إن أحدكم يجمع خلقه في بطن أمه 40 يوما نطفة ثم يكون علقة مثل ذلك ثم يكون مضغة مثل ذلك ثم يرسل إليه الملك فينفخ فيه الروح ويؤمر ب4 كلمات بكتب رزقه وأجله وعمله وشقي أم سعيد فوالله الذي لا إله غيره إن أحدكم ليعمل بعمل أهل الجنة حتى ما يكون بينه وبينها إلا ذراع فيسبق عليه الكتاب فيعمل بعمل أهل النار فيدخلها وإن أحدكم ليعمل بعمل أهل النار حتى ما يكون بينه وبينها إلا ذراع فيسبق عليه الكتاب فيعمل بعمل أهل الجنة فيدخلها. رواه البخاري ومسلم. So it's a longer hadith, but on the authority of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiyallahu anhu, who said that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam said, and he is the believed and the truthful, verily the creation of each one of you is brought together in his mother's womb for 40 days in the form of a nutfa, which is like a drop. Then he becomes a alaqa, a clot of blood, for a like period, a similar period. Then a mudgha, which is a morsel of flesh, for a like period. Then there is sent to him the angel who blows his soul into him and who is commanded with 4 matters: to write down his rizq, sustenance, his lifespan, his actions, and whether he will be happy or unhappy. By the one other than whom there is no deity, verily one of you performs the actions of the people of paradise until there is but an arm's length between him and it, and then that which has been written overtakes him, and so he acts with the actions of the people of the hellfire, and thus enters it, and verily one of you performs the actions of the people of the hellfire until there is but an arm's length between him and it, and that which has been written overtakes him, and so he acts with the actions of the people of paradise, and thus he enters it. So the first thing that we see in this hadith is that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is telling us that, is reminding us or informing us, because at that time maybe this is something that they didn't know, or this is knowledge that they didn't have in deeper detail. But he's telling us that all of us are created from such a simple creation. And we go through these stages in our creation, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has carefully planned out these stages. And this is a reminder for us of where we come from, and like the stature that a human has is really, in his own sight, he might see himself as someone who is important. He might see himself as someone who is amazing, or someone who has certain talents, so therefore he has a certain value. When in reality, we all came from the same place, and we all came from this very simple, very feeble creation. And of course it mentions that we go through the stages of going through 40 days of being a nutfa, a drop, and then alaqa for a like period, so around 40 days. And there's difference of opinion which I'm not going to get into in terms of these different stages. And then mudgha, a morsel of flesh, for a similar period. And then an angel is sent to him who blows the soul into that person. And now the body of the hadith that I want to focus the most on. So this angel comes with 4 things. And this angel is writing down 4 things. And the first one is the rizq. Is that their sustenance, their provision is already written down from when you're still in your mother's womb. So imagine, this sustenance, this provision that we worry so much about, that we go to school for, that we study for, that we put all of our effort and base our entire life sometimes. And we base whether we do something or whether we don't something. We make it a measure for how successful someone is. This rizq is already written down from when you're still in your mother's womb. And then after that, the angel also writes down the lifespan. And this lifespan is a specific time that can never be changed and can never be brought forward or backward. And this time will come no matter what, whether it's in a certain situation where you don't expect to die, or in a situation where you might be in a situation where the expected rate of death is very, very high, but you might come out alive, right? So this time being written down, its significance for us is a reminder that the ajal is in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who takes our life, and it's not anything else. And if we dive deeper into this concept, right, to make it a little bit more clear, if we look at, for example, a gunshot, right? If someone takes a gun and shoots someone, let's say specifically like in the head, somewhere where there's almost no chance of surviving, we still see rare cases where people will survive. We'll have even like a bullet go through certain areas that are critical, and somehow they'll survive, right? In these situations, the reason why is because the only cause of death is intihai al-ajal, the ending of the lifespan. There are certain consequences or certain circumstances that can lead to death, and these circumstances are in the hand of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He controls whether they actually end up taking your life or not. But actually a person dying, the only cause, because if we say something is a cause, then that means it will always lead to that effect. It will always lead to that conclusion. If A happens, then B will for sure happen. But we see that in all these different situations that we can think of from a human perspective, that there's always exceptions where something amazing will happen to a person and somehow they still survive. So the cause of death is only the ending of the lifespan, although circumstances can surround that death. And then next, the angel talks about writing down his actions. Writing down his actions. And this is a point that we also need to spend some time on. Talking about this idea of your actions already being written for you. And then we'll see it right after. It says whether he will be happy or unhappy. And what this means by happy or unhappy is an analogy for being in Jannah or Jahannam. And this is an important point for us to understand, that when the soul is blown into the human, and these four things are being written down: his rizq, his ajal, his actions, and whether he's happy or unhappy, meaning whether he will end up in Jannah or in Jahannam. The natural question that comes to our mind, and I'm sure most of us are thinking, is then what's the point of me doing any action? What's the point of me trying to do better in this dunya when it's already written for me where I'm going? It's already written for me. I'm going to end up either in Jahannam, billah, or in Jannah, inshallah. And all my actions even are written for me. And this is a natural question, a question that it actually should come up if we're contemplating about the hadith. And we see that the Sahaba even asked this question. We see the response of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So, عن عمران بن حسين قال قال رجل يا رسول الله أيعرف أهل الجنة من أهل النار قال نعم. So a man asked Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, are the people of Jannah and the people of Jahannam already known? And the response of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was yes. And then the man said, فَلِمَا يَعْمَلُ الْعَامِلُونَ. So why is it that people still continue to do actions? Why are we still like living in this dunya and trying to do better in this kind of stuff? What's the point? He's asking a very rational question. He's asking a question that comes to our minds too, that okay, if it's already written where I'm going to go, and not just where I'm going to go, but the actions I'm going to do, then what's the point of me trying to do better? Or what's the point of me even trying to do something different? Because only what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has written for me is going to happen, correct? So the response of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam is, كُلٌّ يَعْمَلُ لِمَا خُلِقَ لَهُ أَوْ لِمَا يُسِّرَ لَهُ. And the response of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam is that every person will act for that which he is created for, and that which he is taken towards, or is made easy towards. And we have to stop here and spend some time on this topic, right? And this is a topic we've covered also in tafsir sessions that Sheikh Asim given. Like he spent actually a whole session covering this topic in deeper detail. But this idea of guidance and misguidance. So we all know, like if we take the phrase, guidance is in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? This is something that we all know for a fact. إِنَّكَ لَا تَهْدِي مَنْ أَحْبَبْتَ وَلَكِنَّ اللَّهَ يَهْدِي مَنْ يَشَاءُ. You don't give guidance to who you will. Rather, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives guidance to whoever He wills, right? You don't give guidance to the ones whom you love. So guidance is not in the human's hands. And if guidance were in the human's hands, we would have seen that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the best of creation, who came with the Quran, the best of speech, would have been able to guide the ones he loved. But we see even the ones he loved, some of them didn't become Muslim, and some of them died on kufr. Now, understanding this point, we have to also understand that this is not something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made obligatory on the person, and the person has no control. And this topic that we're covering essentially is the difference, or you can call it dichotomy, between free will and then predestination, or divine decree, you can give, for example. And this is a topic that we have to understand, because if we don't understand it, then we're going to have this doubt, which is very common these days amongst atheists specifically, which is that there's no point in me doing anything. I don't have any free will. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has already written down from when I'm already just barely even alive. I haven't even come out the womb yet, I haven't been born, and my rizq is already written down, my actions are written down, my ajr is written down, whether I'm going to Jannah or Jahannam is written down. And the answer to this is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala lays down a path for guidance. He lays down all of, you could say, the things you can use, or the materials you need, or the sources you need for guidance, and the human being has the choice of whether to take a path of guidance or to take a path of misguidance. And this is the same way when it comes to the free will question. A human there's like, if we can describe it this way, there's two spheres in which a human lives. One sphere is one that he controls, one that he can be the person who governs in that sphere. So for example, I can control whether I move my hand. I can control whether I'm speaking right now. But what I can't control is what you guys do. I can't control what happens outside this room. I can't control what happens somewhere far away. So when we look at it from this perspective, the human, in the sphere that which he controls, he is held accountable for that. And we see, of course, many ayats in the Quran talking about accountability of the actions of the human being, and how the people who disbelieve in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they're not tossed into the fire because of not even someone else misguiding them. There's ayat that talk about other people misguiding, and for example, like leaders and people who were big members of the tribes who misguided the common people into Jahannam. But even then, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts the blame on the individual. And He says that they deceived you, and they were deceivers, but you followed them. And the shaitan himself, we all know this story, right? The shaitan himself will disassociate himself and say, I just told you to do this, you did it on your own. So the individual does these actions himself, and this is something that he has the control over, and he's held accountable from. Whereas the actions of everyone else around him, he's not held accountable for, and rather, he's only held accountable for what he can do to try to change that. So that, hopefully that makes sense, right? So to give an example, I'll give a common example right now. If you look at the issue of Gaza, a lot of the times we'll and it's true, we'll say that it's not really in our hands. We can't end the war right now, right? It's not something that we can do right now with our own hands, which is true. And no one here has the power to end the war right now, right? Otherwise we would have done it, right? But am I held accountable for ending the war right now? Am I held accountable for ending the suffering right now? Or am I held accountable for what am I doing to try to, with whatever's in my capacity, to try to end this war? Or what am I doing that's within my capacity to try to get the power to be able to end this war? Does that make sense? So if someone, another example, if someone is on like an individual level, if someone is committing a sin in front of you, or if someone, for example, is whatever, like swearing or backbiting, whatever, right? I'm not held accountable for what the tongue of the other person is saying, but I am held accountable if I'm sitting there and I'm okay with it, or I start supporting it, or for example, I start participating in it. So this concept of free will and predestination, it has to be, or divine decree, it has to be very well understood. And it has to be understood from a perspective of accountability, and not the question of who creates action. So hopefully that makes sense. And in the question of who creates action, I'm not going to get into deeper. We can in the Q&A if someone's ever heard of this question, but it's a common thing that atheists try to propose and try to poke holes into the belief in God in general. And they pose questions like, for example, if God is all knowledgeable, And this is a trait of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we all confirm. But if God is all knowledgeable, then who creates action? If I'm creating the action, then does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala already know the action that I'm creating? And if He does already know, then am I really doing it, or is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forcing me to do it? So these kinds of questions, if we look at it from the correct perspective of accountability, of does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hold you accountable for your actions? Yes, He does. Does He hold you accountable for the actions of others? So outside of the spheres we talked about, outside of the first sphere, does He hold you accountable for that? He does not. And from this perspective, we see the answer to this question is really, it's a wrong question, but the answer to it is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will hold you accountable for your sphere and not for the sphere that's outside that you can't control. And now moving on to the next part of the hadith, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam says, by the one other than whom there is no deity, verily one of you performs the actions of the people of paradise until there is but an arm's length between him and it, and that which has been written overtakes him, and so he acts with the actions of the people of the hellfire and thus enters it. And over here, this is a very, very important subject. And it's something that sometimes we forget, and that's why we have these sessions for reminders. And Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam is essentially informing us that someone can spend their entire life, imagine, their entire life in the servitude of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he can be someone who's righteous. So notice the description that is given of this person is someone who's doing actions of the people of Jannah. People of Jannah. So he's doing not just staying away from haram, but he's doing good. He's doing righteous actions. But what happened to him is that at the end of his life, towards the end of his life, it says his decree will overtake him, meaning that this person was written down. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had already written down that this person would do this. He ends up doing an action of the people of hellfire, and he enters it because of that. And again, a question will come up from this hadith. It will come up specifically from this part of the hadith, that we understand on the Day of Judgment we have a scale by which good is done, and then good is held, bad is held, and whichever one outweighs the other, if the good outweighs the bad, you enter Jannah. If the bad outweighs the good, you have to pay the price for the bad until you enter Jannah. So from that perspective, how can someone who just does one action, imagine, did one action from the people of hellfire and then he died? So the perspective here has to be clear. The reason why this is because this is the Arabic for it is khawatim, or the end, or the ending of something. And we always speak about, for example, we make a dua, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to commonly make our actions, make the best of our actions the end of them. And the reason why we make this dua is because the action is judged, it's not done correctly except for its ending being correct. And we'll see a hadith about this. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he says, إنما الأعمال بخواتيمها كالوعاء إذا طاب أعلاها طاب أسفله وإذا خبث أعلاه خبث أسفله. So Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam is making a comparison, making an analogy. He's saying that the actions are judged, or they're done correctly by its khawatim, right? So we mentioned the hadith before, the first hadith, إنما الأعمال بالنيات, that actions are judged by intentions, and this is something we can say as like more of a description into this. That actions are judged by the end of it. If it's done correctly, if its ending is correct, then it is correct. And if its ending is incorrect and the rest of it is correct, it comes out to be judged as something that's negative. And to go deeper into what do we mean by done correctly at the end? When someone does an action, let's say for example you prayed salah, you prayed your fard salah. Let's say you walked into that action and you came for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You started praying and you finished your prayer for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But as you were leaving, you saw, for example, other people who were walking in, or for example, you saw people were looking at you, or someone said, MashaAllah, he's praying, or whatever, and you got into your heart crept a little bit of like, you can say arrogance or happiness, that, oh, they saw me doing something good. And this intention is what corrupts the action. So you can think of it in this way. The end of this action meaning the intention that you have after you complete it, or the thought that you have after you complete it, this can corrupt the actual action itself. Like someone, and this is the whole point of this hadith, or the whole point of this part of the hadith, is that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is telling us, similar to the one singular action, that the ending can corrupt it, the same way a person's life can be spent for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, doing the actions of the people of Jannah, and then because of something he did at the end, it corrupts the rest of it. And that's why also in another hadith, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he says, لا عليكم ألا تعجبوا بأحد حتى تنظروا بما يختم له. And the rest of the hadith continues. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he says that you guys should not be amazed, or you can even say over sanctify, or look at someone to be someone who's very righteous, right? Until you see the way they die. Until you see the way they die. Because no one knows what that person is like, or what that person is going to die upon, until he actually dies. So someone might spend his entire life for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then do something at the end that nullifies and corrupts the rest of it. And that's why there's a famous athar, a famous saying of Abdullah Mas'ud radiallahu anhu, and he says, if you were to take, or if the people in general were to take someone to follow, or someone as an example, then take the person who has passed away as an example. And the reason why is because the person who is still alive, he's not safe from fitna. But the person who's passed away, his life is already done. So this perspective, we have to carry it, and we have to embody it, because this corruption of the intention, and not just the intention, but the person understanding that you're never safe from fitna, is really like a scary thought. Because someone can spend their entire life, like we say it 100 times, but someone can spend their entire life doing the actions of people in Jannah. Someone you see right now as a scholar, someone you see right now as someone who's righteous, someone you see right now, it could even be me speaking right now, right? 100%. I could be doing all this. I could be doing things that are good actions, and before I pass away, I do something that's bad, and I enter Jahannam. And none of us are safe from that. So that perspective, we have to instill it in ourselves, and not from the perspective of being not hopeful of the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, rather from the perspective of making sure we always stay sincere to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we see at the end of the hadith, or the next part, it says, and so he acts with the actions of the people of hellfire until he enters it. And verily, one of you performs the actions of the people of the hellfire until there is but an arm's length between him and it, and that which has been written overtakes him. And so he acts with the actions of the people of paradise, and thus he enters it. So also we see at the end of this hadith, the opposite is also true. That someone can do the actions of the people of Jahannam. He can be an oppressor. He can be someone who is completely hates Islam. Someone who you can think of is the worst person ever. Yet, before he dies, he does an action of the people of Jannah, and because of it, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala enters him into Jannah. So, the perspective we should have and take away from this hadith is that it's a longer hadith, but number one, we have to remind ourselves where we came from. We came from a very, very simple creation, and like a feeble creation. So when the human being gets an ego, or when the human being thinks he's arrogant, or when the human being thinks that he's good, or he's doing something amazing, or that he has value because of something that he did in this dunya, he should remind himself of where he came from, and remind himself of these 4 things that are already written down: your rizq, your sustenance, your ajal, the lifespan, your actions, and then also, of course, whether you're going to be happy or unhappy, meaning whether you'll be in Jannah or Jahannam. And then also from that, after realizing this and taking it as a way of life, you also have to remember that on this path, as you're going to do, as you're living your life for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you have to remember and continue to ask for guidance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and hope for a good ending. End to your life that is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because without a good ending that is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this could be something that enters into Jannah or Jahannam. So with that, inshallah, we'll go ahead and end. And